welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a massive, literally life-altering shift in Europe's climate future. We usually talk about cutting emissions, right? But today, we're looking past that standard conversation to face a much harder reality. What comes next?
Okay, let's dive right into this with a hard truth. It's something we really all need to anchor ourselves to. Even if the European Union absolutely nails its ambitious commitment to become climate neutral by 2050, which would be amazing, global average temperatures could still rise to 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the year 2100. So what does that mean? It means a significant degree of warming is, well, already baked in.
Which naturally brings us to the central question of our explainer today. If this level of warming is basically inevitable, regardless of our carbon-cutting successes right now, how does Europe actually adapt? We need a total mindset shift here, guys. We have to smoothly transition from just thinking about how to stop the problem to actively figuring out how to survive it.
To do that, let's make sure we're on the exact same page. You hear the word mitigation thrown around in the news a lot. Efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But our focus today is entirely on adaptation. That means the concrete efforts to avoid, limit, or manage the harmful effects of climate change on our human and natural systems. Think of it less as turning off the faucet and more about building the defenses.
And as you'll see, those harmful effects look drastically different depending on where you happen to live. This brilliantly illustrates the stark geographic divide. We're looking at dramatic temperature rises concentrated heavily in southern Europe, contrasted with some intense precipitation and flooding risks that are skewed heavily toward the north.
This creates a rapidly deepening geographical divide. The reality of climate change in Europe is absolutely not uniform. The south faces severe, compounding droughts and deadly heat waves. The north, meanwhile, is bracing for intense, concentrated rainfall and heavy river flooding. It's a dynamic that threatens to brutally deepen the existing geopolitical and economic fault lines all across the continent.
And the economic toll of this divide? Prepare yourself for some serious sticker shock. 175 billion euros. Yep, that is the staggering estimated annual welfare loss the EU economy could suffer under a 3-degree warming scenario. That's according to modeling from the European Commission's Joint Research Center. 175 billion euros completely wiped out every single year.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is how that 175 billion euro economic pain isn't shared equally. Not even close. There is a stark, almost unbelievable contrast between the regions in southern Europe and regions further north.
Let's break down this inequality, because it's wild. Southern Europe is looking at yearly GDP losses of up to 2.8%, and that's largely driven by the grim reality of human mortality from extreme heat. Meanwhile, places like Scandinavia, they could actually see net economic gains. Yeah, thanks to increased energy output and agricultural production in a warmer, wetter climate. So the South suffers massive losses, while countries north of the Alps lose far less or even come out ahead.
So, you might be wondering, if these impacts are so heavily regional, like a town deciding where to build a local seawall or setting up a municipal cooling center, why does the European Union need to get involved at the highest structural levels? I mean, why not just leave it to the individual countries or cities to figure out?
Well, it really comes down to contrasting the highly localized nature of immediate preparation with the massive scale required for top-tier data and response. Look, local and regional municipalities obviously have the best insight into their own backyards, but they simply don't have the massive scale or the budget required to handle transnational crises or track continent-wide climate patterns.
I mean, a local mayor can't exactly launch a weather satellite or manage a transnational river, right? That is where the power of top-down EU-level action becomes absolutely critical. The EU can pool massive scientific capacity like the incredible Copernicus satellite data and share it with local governments. They can develop standardized methods to track damages, deploy the EU's civil protection mechanism for cross-border emergency response, and protect the massive, interconnected infrastructure that keeps the entire single market running.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. The major flaw in Europe's current system is that the adaptation strategy relies on weak guidelines. There are no binding targets. Responsibilities are constantly being shifted around between local, national, and EU levels. It's a bit of a mess, and this lack of firm structure basically allows reluctant governments to just kick the can down the road.
To fix this dangerous inaction, researchers have proposed a comprehensive blueprint to completely restructure how Europe survives the coming decades. It's built on 3 clear pillars: a 3-layered governance framework, an EU insurance fund, and targeted upfront funding. Let's walk through them.
Let's move to Pillar 1, binding cooperation. This addresses that governance flaw we just talked about head-on. It's all about enforcing strict rules and finally stopping the endless cycle of vague, empty promises.
This requires a highly structured, three-layered governance framework. At the top layer, EU bodies provide the heavy lifting, the data, the platforms, and uniform reporting standards. In the middle, national governments are actually forced to establish binding 10-year adaptation plans with real, measurable targets. No more wiggling out of it. And at the local level, municipalities use that data and funding to execute the concrete physical interventions. It creates a solid chain of accountability, from the top down.
But hey, accountability is only part of the puzzle, right? Adaptation costs a massive amount of money. Consider this single figure, 144 billion euros. That is the projected annual cost of flood damages alone in Europe by the year 2100 if no adaptation measures are taken. That kind of financial shock could easily bankrupt vulnerable individual nations, which perfectly justifies the need for a shared, continent-wide financial safety net.
Which brings us to Pillar 2, an EU insurance scheme. Europe desperately needs a unified mechanism to pay for these inevitable, large-scale disasters without completely tanking individual national economies.
So the crucial point here is how this Solidarity Fund is designed to actually change behavior. Yes, it's financed by national contributions, and it reimburses states after a disaster strikes. But the absolute genius of this fund is that a country's contributions are tied directly to meeting those binding adaptation targets from Pillar 1. If you prepare early and meet your targets, you pay less into the fund. It literally financially incentivizes survival. And for those truly massive continent-wide shocks, the EU would actually be authorized to issue bonds. And finally, Pillar 3, targeted ex-ante funding. Insurance is great for paying out after a disaster ruins a region, sure, but vulnerable areas need cash up front, ex-ante, to actually build their defenses before the storm even hits.
To proactively protect the most vulnerable populations, the EU must redirect existing regional and agricultural funds heavily toward the most disadvantaged areas, particularly the Mediterranean South. We also need to pursue intelligent synergies where cutting emissions and adapting to the climate actually overlap. And finally, there needs to be a dedicated EU instrument specifically designed to fund the protection of critical, cross-border infrastructure before it collapses under climate stress.
When combined, all of this creates a totally cohesive roadmap, binding plans, an incentivized insurance fund, and targeted upfront funding. It takes adaptation from being this frantic, piecemeal local scramble and transforms it into a unified, robust European shield.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. As temperatures inevitably rise and extreme weather multiplies across the continent, will the EU step up and unite to share the burden, or will they fracture under the heat, allowing the climate to brutally deepen the continent's existing divides? It is, without a doubt, the defining question of the century for Europe. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll leave you to ponder that one.